The National Museum of Military History opened every morning at 9 a.m. But Harold Jensen arrived at 7, every single day without exception. For 23 years. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? He would park his old pickup truck in the empty lot, walk to the staff entrance with the key he'd been given 2 decades ago, and make his way through the silent halls to Gallery A7, the Korean War exhibit. The place where history slept in glass cases and behind velvet ropes, waiting to be explained to school children and tourists who would forget everything by lunchtime. But Harold never forgot. That was his curse. In the center of Gallery A7 sat an M46 Patton tank. 44 tons of steel and memory, preserved in perfect condition except for the parts that couldn't be cleaned. The scorch marks on the left side. The dent in the turret where a Chinese mortar had struck. And inside, visible only if you knew where to look, the rust-brown stains that had once been red. Every morning, before the lights came on, before the other staff arrived, Harold would stand before that tank. He would place his weathered hand on the cold metal and speak 5 names into the silence. Tommy, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Pete. Then he would close his eyes, breathe through the pain that never dulled, and compose himself. By the time the doors opened, he was just Harold, the elderly volunteer guide with the friendly smile and the endless patience for children's questions. No one knew. No one had ever known. And Harold had planned to take his secret to the grave. Until the boy asked the question. The school group arrived at 10:15, 27 third graders from Jefferson Elementary with 2 exhausted teachers and 1 parent chaperone who was already checking her phone. Harold greeted them with his usual warmth, handed out the children's activity booklets, and began the tour. They moved through the Revolutionary War Gallery, the Civil War exhibit, the World War II section with its life-size dioramas. The children's attention wandered. Some poked each other. Some yawned. Harold didn't mind. He had given this tour thousands of times. He knew which exhibits would catch their interest. The weapons, the uniforms, the stories of bravery and sacrifice. But today one child was different. He was small for his age, with serious eyes behind round glasses and the kind of intense focus that suggested he actually listened when adults spoke. His name tag read Lucas. While the other children fidgeted and whispered, Lucas studied every exhibit, read every placard, asked every question that entered his mind. How heavy is that rifle? Did soldiers really sleep in those tents? Why did they use horses in World War I? Harold answered them all. He liked children who asked questions. They reminded him of someone he used to know. Someone who had asked too many questions and died too young. When they reached Gallery A7, Lucas stopped in his tracks. Whoa, he breathed. Is that a real tank? Harold smiled. It's an M46 Patton. Used by American forces during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Did it fight? Like in a real battle? It did. This particular tank served in one of the most famous battles of the war, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Lucas pressed his face against the glass barrier, his breath fogging the surface. What happened there? Harold felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He had told this story hundreds of times, always in the same clinical, historical terms. The facts without the feelings. The summary without the screams. It was November 1950. American and United Nations forces were advancing north through Korea when they were surrounded by Chinese troops. Over 120,000 Chinese soldiers against about 30,000 of ours. The temperature dropped to minus 35 degrees. Men froze to death in their sleep. Equipment stopped working. It was one of the most brutal engagements in American military history. Did we win? We survived. The American forces fought their way out of the encirclement and made it to the coast for evacuation. But thousands didn't make it. Thousands never came home. Lucas stared at the tank. What about the people in this tank? Did they survive? The question hit Harold like a bullet. He opened his mouth to give the standard answer, the one that deflected, that generalized, that kept the wound safely covered. But before he could speak, Lucas had found the small plaque at the base of the exhibit. The plaque Harold had asked the museum to remove a dozen times. The plaque they kept because it was historically significant. Chosin Reservoir, December 1950, Lucas read aloud, his voice clear in the silent gallery. This M46 Patton tank was crewed by 5 soldiers of the 1st Marine Division. During the breakout from the reservoir, the tank was struck by enemy fire but continued fighting until its ammunition was exhausted. 4 crew members were killed. Sole survivor, Sergeant Harold Jensen. Lucas turned around. His serious eyes found the name tag on Harold's chest. Jensen, the boy said slowly. Your name is Jensen too. His face scrunched in concentration. Are you the same person? The gallery went silent. The other children had wandered ahead, but the two teachers and the parent chaperone were still within earshot. They turned, curious, waiting for Harold's answer. He should have lied. He had lied for 7 decades. To friends, to family, to every person who had ever asked about his military service. I just did my time, he would say. Nothing special. The words came so easily after all these years. But looking into Lucas's eyes, those serious, searching, innocent eyes, Harold couldn't lie. Not to a child. Not about this. Yes, he heard himself say. I'm the same person. The words hung in the air like smoke. The teachers exchanged glances. The parent looked up from her phone. And Lucas, the boy who asked too many questions, asked one more. What happened? Harold's legs felt weak. He reached out and steadied himself on the glass barrier, his hand leaving a print on the surface he polished every morning. It was December 6, 1950, he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin, distant, as if it was coming from far away. We were part of the rear guard, covering the retreat. The Chinese were everywhere. We couldn't see them, but we could hear them, bugles, whistles, thousands of feet crunching through the snow. He wasn't in the museum anymore. He was back there, in the frozen hell of North Korea, 19 years old and certain he was going to die. Tommy Kowalski was our driver. 20 years old, from Chicago. He had a girl back home named Mary. Showed us her picture every night. Private Rodriguez was the loader, 18, barely shaving, lied about his age to enlist. Chen was the gunner. Williams was the commander, a sergeant like me but better, smarter, braver. And Pete. Harold's voice cracked. 71 years and he still couldn't say Pete's name without breaking. Pete was my brother. My little brother. He had followed me into the Marines. I promised our mother I would keep him safe. The teachers had pulled the other children back now, gathering them in the doorway of the gallery. They sensed that something was happening, something beyond a routine museum tour. The children, even the fidgety ones, had gone quiet. Harold didn't notice. He was looking at the tank, but he was seeing December 1950. The Chinese hit us at dawn. Mortar first, then machine gun fire from 3 directions. We were in the middle of the column trying to push through to the coast. Tommy got hit first, shrapnel through the driver's viewport. He died before we could pull him out. Harold's hand was shaking now, pressed flat against the glass as if he could reach through and touch the cold steel. I took over driving. Chen kept firing the main gun until we ran out of shells. Rodriguez was throwing grenades out of the hatch, anything to keep them back. Williams was on the radio calling for support that wasn't coming. And Pete. He closed his eyes. Pete was outside the tank. He had climbed out to fix the track. We had thrown a link on a frozen rock. I told him to wait, to stay inside, but he said we would all die if the tank couldn't move. He was always like that. Always thinking of everyone else first. A tear escaped Harold's closed eyes, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. I heard the shot. I didn't see it. I was inside trying to restart the engine. But I heard him scream. My little brother screaming my name. By the time I got to the hatch, he was gone. The Chinese had pulled him off the tank and he couldn't finish. 71 years and he still couldn't say the words. I tried to go after him. Williams grabbed me, held me back. He said Pete was already dead, that I would just be throwing my life away. We fought. I hit him, I can't remember, and then the second mortar hit. Harold opened his eyes. They were fixed on the scorch marks on the tank's left side. That one killed Rodriguez and wounded Williams. Chen was hit too, but he kept firing, hand weapons now, anything he could find. I dragged Williams to the back of the tank, tried to stop the bleeding. But there was so much blood and it was so cold and I didn't know what I was doing. His voice had dropped to a whisper. Williams died in my arms. He told me to keep going, to get the tank out, to survive. Someone has to tell them, he said. Someone has to remember. Then Chen took a round to the head and I was alone. The gallery was absolutely silent. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that they were witnessing something sacred, something private, something that should perhaps never have been spoken aloud but needed to be. I drove the tank for 6 more miles, Harold said. Alone. Through enemy fire, through frozen roads, through the bodies of men I had known and men I hadn't. I don't know how I survived. The fuel line was damaged. The engine kept stalling. I had to get out and fix it 3 times while bullets sparked off the armor. He touched the glass again, his fingers tracing the outline of the turret. When I finally reached the coast, when they pulled me out of this tank, I couldn't speak. Not for 3 weeks. The doctor said it was shocked that my voice would come back. And it did, but I never told anyone what happened. Not really. Not the whole truth. Why not? Lucas asked. His voice was small but steady. Harold looked at the boy, at this child who had seen through decades of silence with a single question. Because I survived, Harold said. And they didn't. Tommy, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, they had families too. They had lives, dreams, people who loved them. Why did I get to live when they died? What made me special? He shook his head. Nothing. The answer is nothing. I'm not a hero. I'm just the one who was lucky enough to be in the right spot when the mortars hit. Lucky enough to not get shot when I was outside fixing the engine. Lucky enough to be alone in a tank when I should have been dead with the rest of them. And Pete? Lucas asked quietly. Your brother? Harold's face crumpled. For a moment he looked every one of his 89 years. Pete is why I'm here, he whispered. Every morning I come to this museum before it opens. I stand in front of this tank, this coffin on tracks, and I apologize. I tell him I'm sorry I couldn't save him. I tell him I'm sorry I survived. I tell him I've tried every day since to be worthy of the life he didn't get to live. The silence stretched on. Then slowly the parent chaperone began to cry. One of the teachers wiped her eyes. And Lucas, the serious boy with the glasses, did something no one expected. He walked to Harold's side and took his hand. I don't think you should be sorry, Lucas said. I think Pete would be proud of you. Harold looked down at the small hand in his. Why do you say that? Because you kept your promise. You said Williams told you that someone had to remember. And you did. You remember them every day. You tell their story to kids like me even when it hurts. That's not being a coward. That's being brave. Harold felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been locked tight for 71 years. I never thought of it that way. My grandpa was in a war too, Lucas said. He doesn't talk about it. My mom says it's because it makes him sad. But I wish he would tell me. I want to know what he did. I want to know who he was before he got old. He looked up at Harold with those serious eyes. Maybe that's why you're here. Not to apologize, but to make sure people don't forget. Because if you didn't tell us, who would? Harold stared at the child. In 60 years of giving tours, no one had ever said anything like this. Adults offered sympathy, thanked him for his service, told him he was a hero and walked away to forget everything within the hour. But this child, this 8-year-old with glasses and too many questions, had seen something Harold had missed for 7 decades. He wasn't just surviving. He was witnessing. He was the living memory of 5 men who had no one else to speak for them. Tommy loved jazz music, Harold said suddenly. The words came out before he could stop them. He used to tap out rhythms on the tank controls. Drove Williams crazy, but the rest of us loved it. Said he was going to open a jazz club in Chicago after the war. Lucas listened, his hand still holding Harold's. Rodriguez wanted to be a teacher. He was always reading, even in the foxholes. He taught Chen how to play poker and taught me how to write letters to girls. He said the secret was to be honest about being scared. Women appreciate vulnerability. A small laugh escaped Harold's lips, the first time he had laughed about the war in 71 years. Chen barely spoke English when he enlisted, but by the time he died he was telling jokes. Bad jokes, terrible jokes, but he was so proud of them. And Williams? Williams was the best man I ever knew. Strict but fair. He never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Harold paused and his voice softened. And Pete. My little brother Pete. He was 17 when he enlisted. I was furious, we both were, my mother and I. But he said he couldn't stay home while I was over there. He said brothers stick together. Tears were streaming down Harold's face now, but he was smiling. He was right. Brothers do stick together. And I've been sticking with him, every single day, standing in front of this tank like an idiot, apologizing to a piece of metal. He looked at Lucas. But maybe you're right. Maybe I wasn't apologizing. Maybe I was keeping my promise. The tour ended differently than any tour Harold had ever given. Instead of the standard facts and dates, he told stories. Real stories. The kind that don't appear in history books or museum placards. He told them about Tommy's jazz rhythms and Rodriguez's love letters. He told them about Chen's terrible jokes and Williams's quiet leadership. He told them about Pete, not just how he died but how he lived. How he laughed at everything, feared nothing, loved with his whole heart. By the time they reached the exit, every adult in the group was crying. Even some of the children had tears in their eyes. But they weren't sad tears, not entirely. They were the tears that come when something true touches something deep. Lucas's teacher approached Harold before they left. I don't know what to say, she said. I've never. Thank you for bringing him, Harold said, nodding toward Lucas. He asked the right question. He always does. She shook Harold's hand. Would you? I mean, is there any way you could come to our school? Talk to more kids? What you shared today, it matters. It really matters. Harold hesitated. For 71 years he had hidden. For 71 years silence had been his armor. But Lucas's words echoed in his mind. If you didn't tell us, who would? I'd like that, he heard himself say. I'd like that very much. Over the following months, Harold Jensen became something he had never expected to be. A voice. He spoke at Lucas's school, then at other schools. Word spread. A local news station ran a story. Then a national outlet picked it up. Within a year, the 89-year-old museum volunteer had become one of the most requested speakers in the military veterans community. He told his story everywhere. At schools, at veterans halls, at military academies. He told it on podcasts and in interviews, on morning shows and at memorial services. And every time he told it the same way, not as a hero but as a witness. Not glorifying war but honoring the men who fought it. He received letters from veterans who had never spoken about their own wars. You gave me permission, one wrote. If you could share your pain, maybe I could share mine. He received letters from children who had started asking their grandparents about their service. He received letters from families who had finally learned what their fathers and grandfathers had seen and done and survived. But the letter that mattered most came from a woman in California. Her name was Mary Kowalski. She was 91 years old, Tommy's girl, the one in the photograph he had shown them every night. She had never married, had spent her whole life wondering what had happened to the boy who had promised to come home and open a jazz club. For 70 years I didn't know, she wrote. The telegram said killed in action, but nothing else. No one could tell me how he died or if he suffered or if anyone was with him at the end. I've been carrying that not knowing my whole life. Her letter continued. Then I saw you on television. I heard you say his name, Tommy Kowalski from Chicago. I heard you say he loved jazz, that he tapped rhythms on the tank controls. That was my Tommy. That was the man I loved. She had enclosed something with the letter, a faded photograph of a young woman and a young soldier, laughing on a beach somewhere, their whole lives ahead of them. Thank you for remembering him, she wrote. Thank you for telling me he wasn't alone. Thank you for carrying him all these years when no one else could. Harold read that letter and cried for an hour. Then he wrote her back. The documentary premiered 3 years later. It was called The Last Witness, and it told the story of Harold Jensen and the 5 men who had died in an M46 Patton tank in December 1950. The filmmakers had tracked down the families of all the crew members. They had found Rodriguez's grandchildren in Texas, Chen's great-niece in San Francisco, Williams's daughter in a nursing home in Virginia. They had interviewed Mary Kowalski about the love of her life, and they had filmed Harold standing in front of the tank, telling his story one more time. But the most powerful moment in the film came at the end. The filmmakers had arranged a gathering at the museum, all the surviving family members, brought together for the first time. They stood in Gallery A7, surrounding the tank that had been both a weapon and a tomb. Harold introduced them to each other. This is Tommy's Mary. This is Rodriguez's grandson, Michael. He became a teacher just like his grandfather wanted to be. This is Chen's great-niece, Lucy. She tells terrible jokes just like him. And this is Williams's daughter, Patricia. She has his eyes. They stood in a circle around the tank, these strangers connected by a 73-year-old tragedy. And then Harold did something he had never done before. He asked them to help him say the names. Tommy, he said. Tommy, they repeated. Rodriguez. Rodriguez. Chen. Chen. Williams. Williams. And then his voice breaking, Pete. Pete, they said together. And for the first time in 73 years, Harold Jensen didn't say those names alone. Harold Jensen died on December 6, 2024, exactly 74 years after the battle that had defined his life. He was 93 years old. His funeral was held at the National Museum of Military History, in Gallery A7, in front of the tank he had guarded for 27 years. Over 1,000 people attended. Veterans in wheelchairs and dress uniforms. Children from dozens of schools. Families of the fallen, connected now by grief and gratitude. Lucas was there, not 8 anymore but 18, a freshman at West Point. He gave one of the eulogies. Harold Jensen taught me that history isn't just dates and facts, Lucas said. It's people. It's Tommy and Rodriguez and Chen and Williams and Pete. It's every soldier who went to war and every family who waited at home. It's the stories we carry and the stories we share. He looked at the tank, gleaming under the gallery lights. Harold spent 70 years thinking he survived by accident. But I don't think it was an accident. I think he survived so he could tell us. So we would know. So Tommy and Rodriguez and Chen and Williams and Pete wouldn't just be names on a plaque. They would be real. They would be remembered. They would matter. Lucas saluted, a crisp, perfect salute that would have made any drill sergeant proud. Mission complete, Sergeant Jensen. You can rest now. Your brothers are waiting. In Harold's will, he had made one request, that his ashes be placed inside the M46 Patton tank in Gallery A7, alongside the memories of the men who had died there. The museum agreed. They installed a small plaque inside the tank, invisible to visitors, known only to the staff. Sergeant Harold Jensen, USMC. 1931 to 2024, he kept his promise. He never forgot. And every morning before the museum opens, a volunteer guide walks to Gallery A7, places a hand on the cold metal, and speaks 6 names into the silence. Tommy, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Pete, and Harold. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to tell the story. And as long as that tank sits in that gallery, as long as one person knows what happened inside it, those 6 men will never truly be gone. Moral of the story, survival isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. The ones who live carry the ones who didn't. And the greatest honor we can give the dead is to make sure their stories are never forgotten. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more soldier stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.